Okay, I'm going to talk to you now about A Wife in London, which was written by Thomas Hardy. Now, one of my colleagues reckons that this poem is the perfect poem to pick because it links with pretty much every theme and it could link with pretty much every other poem. Despite that, I think students often forget about it or don't like it or ignore it, even though it's not that complicated. There's lots of nice ideas in there. It goes with war, it goes with loss, it goes with relationships, there's a bit about nature in there, and a bit about power in there. There's all sorts going on. So it's a poem written in 1899 by this guy in the middle called Thomas Hardy. I'll tell you a bit about context in a moment. Clearly set in London, as you can see, Wife in London, and it's about the Second Boer War, which isn't one that we really know about or study too much, but it was one that had quite significant consequences for people alive at the time. It was fought in South Africa by the British Empire. With that. So, if you could pause and read this poem aloud, that would be great. The thing to note is that this poem is clearly in two sections. Okay, so we have the tragedy on the first half, and then we have the irony. And it's quite important to write about those and know that there's a huge shift between those. So there's almost like a Volta with the term with that. So, my overview of the poem would be that at the start, the poet introduces the setting of London. Okay, so the weather clearly reflects the somber tone of the poem throughout. So we get the tawny vapour, we get the webby fold on fold of the fog seemingly, and we get the street lamp glimmering cold. And I think it's interesting we have a place specifically, so by the Thames, alright, where this tragedy takes place. In the middle of the poem, the tragedy becomes apparent. The wife from the title receives news of her husband's death in the war. Okay, and then this is the bit where it shifts, and this is the bit students sometimes miss. But then it says about the irony, okay, because the next day, the wife receives a letter from her husband sent before he died, okay. So at the start of it, she learns a tragedy, which is that her husband has passed away, but then in the irony bit, a letter that he had sent before he died, obviously, then gets delivered, all right. So day one, she gets the message from the messenger saying that her husband has fallen in the far south land, and then 'tis the morrow, so tomorrow, the next day, the postman then sends a letter which has got her now deceased husband's handwriting with it. Okay, so the irony is this idea that a second letter comes afterwards. At the end of the poem, there's almost like a hopeful tone of the husband's letter, which contrasts with the deep sorrow of his death and the wife's grief too. Okay, so he says about the summer weather, the new love they would learn, or at home planned jaunts of break and burn, hope's return, all this kind of positivity, which contrasts hugely with the wife's grief. Perspective-wise, third-person speaker, observing the impact of loss on a wife specifically, and I think the key message is the sense of loss associated with war, the grief a wife feels when her husband dies, and I think Hardy's also talking about the little control we actually have over our lives, because the wife here is powerless, which links into some nice ideas from Ozymandias potentially, with that sense of power that he felt he had and then lost. All right, the wife in London is completely powerless. She can't do anything, can't change anything. She just sits there as these letters come. So if we think about context, it was written in 1899, 2 months after the start of the Second Boer War in South Africa. There's a picture there of the Boers in battle. And the South Africans were fighting against the British Empire. It was a conflict that's all about gold reserves and trying to take advantage of the natural resources in South Africa from the past of the British. It's a very uneven matchup. Britain had about 400,000 troops in South Africa. The Boers had about 52,000. There was writing at the time that Hardy was rumored to be a pacifist, so somebody who supported peace. And had anti-war views, and I think that those are clear in A Wife in London. And we also see that clear image of London at the turn of the 20th century. An interesting time historically, a London that was always focused on industrialisation, the Victorian era, is kind of starting to change, starting to become a bit more modern with that. Thomas Hardy is much more celebrated as a novelist than a poet, and I think that the tragedy and the irony reflects that kind of novelist style that he has. He's very, very famous English writer of the late 1800s, and then in the late 1800s and early 1900s, he turned his kind of way to poetry. So by way of analysis, I think there's quite a lot to like here, really. I've highlighted a fair few bits, at least one from each stanza that we could look at. So if I'm thinking here about, she sits in a tawny vapour. Tawny means kind of dark, and the vapour is the kind of fog or the darkness of the room. I think this is an interesting idea. She's passive here. She's not doing a lot. And again, when I was talking about power, she doesn't have the sense of control over anything. And we get the sign here that she almost just can't see things clearly, can't see things straight, perhaps there. I like the waning taper, a taper being a candle. All right, and waning means kind of slowly dying away. All right, so she's the webby fold on fold like a waning taper. The street lamp glimmers cold. We get the atmosphere, we get the somber nature and the somber mood with that. There's no warmth in the poem. The glimmers cold of the street lamp. It's almost like the hope becoming extinguished there. All right, where there's lights, there's hope, and when there's not, there's none. So we see that idea. Then we get the messenger's knock. So we get almost like a shift away from that. I think the cracks smartly is a good use of onomatopoeia there. Not always the most interesting device to look at, but we can see that she's almost forced to kind of come out of this daze that she's in. Flash news in her hand of meaning it dazes to understand. It's about the speed and the quickness here of that life-changing news that she gets, saying he has fallen in the far southland. And I think the dazes almost links in with this kind of hazy weather, with the hazy tone and the feelings that she's got not being quite clear there. And then we get the irony, and you can analyse the tragedy and the irony and think about those. So 'tis tomorrow, so tomorrow, the next day, the fog hangs thicker. Okay, so it's still foggy, all right, but hangs, a word associated with death. There you could look at fog, lack of clarity, and thicker. Perhaps it's almost a metaphor for the sense of loss that she's feeling, all right, and the lack of clarity of thought that she has with that sense of grief. And the postman brings this a letter, which the lines disclosed by the firelight flicker, and then his hand whom the worm now knows. It's not very subtle, it just means that he is now buried, but he seems to be able to bring this one last message to her, and that's the irony of it. All right, so day one gets the message that he's dead. Day two, the irony that actually he writes a letter about his hoped return, as we see the jaunt, so the days out of break and burn in the summer weather and of new love that they would learn. All of this hope here, it's meant to juxtapose with the grief in the first half of the poem. It's interesting that he's writing his hoped return. I think of the summer weather is contrasting as well with the fog hanging thicker. And I think this is just meant to emphasise and exaggerate the grief and almost the loss that she feels there. So I don't think it's too complicated to poem by those messages there, but I do think students sometimes get a bit bogged down in it, and I don't quite know what that is. So, good comparisons. I think it links to the manhunt quite clearly. All right, both deal with the impact war has on the wife, the soldier. A bit of difference. Manhunt is from the perspective of the wife, whereas this one is third person, but focusing on where the wife is. But there is a contrast because the husband is hurt but alive, whereas the husband is obviously dying, the wife in London. So if you think about war or relationships there, or almost loss, those two poems work together. And I think an interesting one could be with the soldier. So in The Soldier, Brooks celebrates the prospect of dying for his country, whereas the wife in Hardy's poem only experiences the deep grief and sorrow at the passing of her husband. So where there's glory in death in the soldier, there is seemingly none in it. In fact, the hopes that they had, we can see that possibility of a life after war. That soldier doesn't want to die. He wants to come back and he wants to enjoy that new love that they would learn. But I think it's an interesting contrast. They're actually quite similar eras as well. They're only 15 years apart. So, possible questions. Wife and London's poem about loss. How does Thomas Hardy present loss in the poem? I think that was actually one of the exam papers 2 years ago. And refer to the context of the poem, you answer. Or you could compare it to another poem about loss or grief, which could be those ones. Another poem about loss is as imperceptibly as grief. Relationships, there are plenty, like Cozy Apologia, for example. But no, hopefully that's been useful, and do make sure that you kind of annotate and make notes on some of those key messages and ideas there. Thank you very much.